Georgia, 1854. Inside a plantation house heavy with heat, a white curtain draped over the bed sways in still air. The master sleeps soundly, his breath steady like the ticking of a hidden clock. Beyond the door, a flickering oil lamp throws long, broken shadows across the floor. Henry Fields, dressed in ragged cloth, stands motionless, more statue than man. That night, meant for dreams, turned into a courtroom without drums, without soldiers, only silence, delivering its own verdict. Henry Fields was born not under chandeliers but under a roof of warped planks, where smoke from the hearth clung to the walls and silence was taught before speech. His first lullabies were whispers, meant not to wake the overseer who prowled the night. From infancy, he learned that survival was a lesson of silence, ears open, mouth closed. His mother was the first teacher. She had no books, no slate, no chalk, only gestures, eyes, and instinct. She showed him how to read the skies, to know when rain was coming, how to study the earth, to find roots, even in barren ground, and most importantly, how to watch a man's eyes to glimpse the storm before it struck. These were not lessons of choice but of necessity, carved into her by lashes and loss. She passed them on to Henry, like a fragile inheritance. Every evening, the plantation glowed in two colors. On the hill, the master's house burned bright with lamps and polished wood, windows reflecting gold. In the quarters, only the orange haze of cooking fires lit the air, carrying the smell of beans, smoke, and tired breath. The two worlds were a few paces apart, yet separated by a canyon deeper than any river. Henry's earliest memories were of staring at that glowing house, wondering how light could sit so close, yet never touch. In the quarters, children invented games with stones and sticks, their laughter quickly swallowed when footsteps approached. In the big house, children played with dolls brought from Europe, their laughter unhindered, unpunished. Henry understood the difference not from words but from rhythm. One laughter was heavy, checked, braced for interruption. The other flowed freely, without fear. He grew tall for his age, shoulders already bent from hauling wood and water. To the master, Henry was just another body, another set of hands. To the other children in rags, he became something else, a silent observer. He did not speak much, but when he did, his words cut through noise like a blade. He had inherited his mother's eyes, the eyes that read storms, and though he was still a boy, people whispered that he saw too much. As the years folded in on themselves, Henry's world remained one of shadows, always watching, never stepping too close to light. But shadows have memory. Shadows grow long when the sun sets. And Henry, the child of shadows, was already learning that every silence carried within it the seed of judgment. Every man who breaks does not break in the same way. For Henry Fields, it was not one whip, not one insult, but a series of small deaths that ignited the fire. He had once loved a girl from the quarters. Her name is lost to history, carried only in the faint traces of a song passed among the women. She was taken in a single afternoon, traded like a coin across the table. Henry was not allowed to hold her, not even to watch her leave. She vanished as quickly as smoke in wind, and he was left standing in silence, his fists clenched so tight the nails drew blood. That was the first loss. The second was his father, a man who worked until his body crumbled under the Georgia sun, his back scarred into maps of cruelty. One day he collapsed in the field, never to rise again. They buried him not in the white cemetery, but in a ditch beyond the trees. No stone, no marker, just dirt pressed flat, as if he had never been. Henry's grief was not allowed to exist. Grief itself was considered rebellion. Each of these moments etched lines into him, invisible tally marks of injustice. He carried them like an unseen book of debts, written not with ink, but with memory and scar tissue. And with each entry, the weight grew heavier, the silence louder. The master, his master, was a man who spoke often of mercy. He read the Bible in the morning, words dripping with piety, but by afternoon, he would sell, divide, whip, destroy. His mouth said grace, but his hands wrote torment. Henry knew then that mercy was only another chain, a false promise to keep the enslaved bowed. Hope became a myth, like spring after an endless winter. Henry learned that waiting for kindness was like waiting for rain in a desert sky, a prayer answered only with silence. And so the fire lit, not the fire of rage alone, but the fire of clarity. He saw the truth that survival was no longer enough. To live as shadow was to vanish. To act, even once, was to exist. That fire, born of loss, sharpened by grief, would one day lead him into the master's room. But for now, it smoldered quietly, invisible to all but Henry himself. Preparation does not always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like routine. Henry Fields did not sharpen his hands on weapons. He honed them on chores. Every bucket of water carried, every log split, every nail hammered into wood was a rehearsal. His muscles learned the rhythm of precision, his mind the patience of repetition. He understood that to move too fast was to reveal intent, but to move too slow was to invite suspicion. In the master's house, he studied without appearing to study. He knew the creak of the stair at the third step, the way the door hinge sighed when opened, the exact spot where moonlight broke through the curtain. He watched how the oil lamp dimmed around midnight, how the master's breath shifted from restless to steady after his evening glass of whiskey. These were not idle observations. They were a silent clock counting down. The quarters taught him to wait. Nights by the fire, he would keep his hands still while the others spoke in whispers, as if silence itself were training him. His eyes drifted to the great oak tree beyond the fields, the same tree that had watched over him as a boy. Its branches stretched outward like arms, waiting to hold something heavy. Each night, it seemed to lean closer, as though it knew what was coming. Henry carried no book, no pen, but in his mind he etched a plan as carefully as if it had been carved in stone. He practiced not the act itself, but the stillness that would follow it, the calm that must mask the storm. To falter in silence would mean discovery. To hesitate would mean death. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. To anyone watching, Henry was simply another figure in rags, carrying out orders, fading into the background. But beneath that disguise, he was building a ritual. The oil lamp became his metronome, the floorboards his scripture, the shadows his confidants. Preparation is not always a weapon sharpened. Sometimes it is silence sharpened until it can cut. The man Henry served was not merely cruel. He was contradiction made flesh. Each morning, the master stood tall in his parlor, Bible in hand. His voice carried verses of mercy, forgiveness, salvation. His words filled the house with a theater of righteousness. Yet outside those polished doors, his actions erased every syllable. His whip tore through skin as easily as pen across paper. He divided families the way others might shuffle cards without pause, without thought. To the community, he was a man of standing. To the enslaved, he was a wound that never closed. His smile could precede a sale. His prayer could follow a beating. In him, Henry saw the perfect hypocrisy, a man who cloaked chains in the language of grace. Every scar on Henry's back was a sentence, authored by that man. Each line of torn flesh was a scripture of cruelty. The pain had faded, but the memory remained carved as deep as any brand. When Henry bent in the fields, he carried more than baskets of cotton. He carried those scars, each one whispering of debts unpaid. The master slept each night like any other man. His head sank into pillows, his breath slowed, his body softened into dreams. But Henry knew. When the eyes closed, it was not innocence that slept. It was the system itself, lying unguarded. In sleep, the master was stripped of ceremony, stripped of power. In sleep, he was simply a man. Yet that man held the weight of every lash, every sail, every grave without a stone. To Henry, the master was not a single person but the face of a structure that ground lives into dust. Killing him would not unmake the system, but it would unmask the lie that men who preached grace while dealing in chains could rest forever without judgment. And so, in Henry's mind, the master became not only an enemy but an emblem. He was not flesh alone, he was glass already cracked, waiting for the final shatter. The night did not thunder, it whispered. Cicadas hummed outside, their song folding into the heavy air of Georgia's summer. The plantation house, wrapped in white curtains, lay still. Inside, the master's room glowed faintly from an oil lamp, its flame trembling as if it sensed what was coming. Henry Fields moved like a shadow, unpinned from its body, bare feet pressed against floorboards, each step memorized from months of study. The third plank near the bed groaned faintly, just as he had expected, but the sound was swallowed by the drone of insects outside. The curtain swayed as he entered, brushing his shoulder like a hand reluctant to let him pass. The master lay stretched upon polished wood and linen, his breath deep, steady, unaware. In that moment, he was no overseer, no sermonizing hypocrite, no wielder of the whip, only a man suspended in the fragile innocence of sleep. Henry stood above him, and the silence thickened. The room seemed to hold its breath. The lamp's glow pulled long shadows across the walls, painting the chamber as if it were a cathedral of judgment. The first blow was not sound, but absence of sound. It split the night, not with noise, but with an emptiness so heavy it pressed against the walls. That silence was more violent than any cry. It was the silence of history's balance tilting, of the scales groaning under the weight of a single act. In that instant, Henry was no longer only a slave. He was no longer only a son, a lover, a mourner. He was executioner, cloaked not in robes of law but in rags of labor. The bed became gallows, the curtain a shroud, the oil lamp a witness. When he stepped back, breath quick and shallow, he knew there was no return. Shadows had crossed into light. Silence had become verdict. The house remained still, yet everything had changed. The master's fall was not the end. It was the opening of a ledger Henry had carried inside his mind for years. There were others, men whose hands had not signed deeds but had held whips, whose laughter had cut as sharply as any lash, a driver who had dragged Henry's father through mud until his chest collapsed, a foreman who had traded children like livestock, a trader whose gold teeth shone while families wept. None of them slept within reach of mercy. Henry had no parchment, no ink, no courtroom, but he had a list written in scars, memorized in grief, and he had a ritual. Each act followed a rhythm. A door creaked, footsteps quickened, firelight trembled. Then silence, always silence. Henry did not roar, did not cry out. He let absence speak louder than words. Each man fell into the hush, swallowed by the same judgment that had begun in the master's room. To some, it may have looked like madness. To Henry, it was ceremony. Each strike was not random fury, but a step in a procession. He was not killing men alone. He was dismantling roles: driver, foreman, trader, master. Each figure was a brick in the wall of bondage, and Henry's ritual was to unmake them, one by one. But rituals do not stay hidden. Whispers spread through the quarters, voices hushed, yet trembling with awe. Children were warned not to wander. Women sang songs whose words bent around secrets. The air itself seemed charged, as if lightning stalked the ground at night. Among the enslaved, Henry's name became both shield and omen. Among the masters, it became dread, a shadow glimpsed at the edge of lamplight. Patrols tightened, sermons grew harsher, but fear had already seeped into the soil. Henry walked in silence, carrying not triumph but gravity. Each act added weight to his shoulders, yet he continued, because to stop was to betray the memory of those whose names filled his hidden list. The chain of revenge was not a frenzy. It was a liturgy of the oppressed, written not in words but in silence, repeated until silence itself began to sing. Every ritual ends with a final name. For Henry, it was the overseer, the man whose cruelty had not only scarred his back, but had carved terror into generations of the enslaved. The meeting did not happen in fields or in the master's room. It happened in the stables, where the smell of hay and sweat lingered heavy in the air. Horses stirred uneasily, their hooves scraping the dirt, as if they too sensed the air thickening into judgment. Henry entered first, the ragged shirt clinging to his skin with sweat. He carried no symbol of authority, no chain of command, no court decree. Yet he stood with a presence that filled the space, his silence louder than any speech. The overseer arrived soon after, lantern in hand. Its glow cast jagged light across the stalls, catching the lines of his hardened face. He paused when he saw Henry waiting, his jaw tightening, the lantern trembling slightly in his grip. Perhaps for the first time, he understood that the shadows he had long ignored could rise against him. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The silence was the dialogue, and the moonlight pouring through the stable slats became their only witness. The overseer reached for his weapon habit, instinct, the reflex of a man who had lived by force, but Henry did not flinch. His stillness was unyielding, as if he had become the oak tree outside, rooted, immovable. They faced each other under the pale glow, not as man and slave, but as judge and judged. The stable became a stage, the lantern a spotlight, the night air an audience of ghosts. For every scar carved into Henry's back, for every family torn apart, for every grave left without a stone, this was the moment of accounting. When the silence finally broke, it was not with words but with action, and as quickly as it began, it ended. The overseer's breath was cut short, leaving only the sound of horses shifting nervously in their stalls. Henry did not linger. He stepped out into the night, the moon following him like a pale eye. The confrontation was finished, the ritual complete. But fate had already begun to close its circle. Rebellion is not permitted to rest. The hand of vengeance may strike, but the hand of power always strikes back. Henry's acts did not remain hidden long. Whispers of his ritual moved through the quarters like wind through grass, spreading faster than chains could contain. To the enslaved, his name became a song sung in hushed tones. To the masters, it became thunder on the horizon, a terror they could not ignore. The patrols found him before dawn. Surrounded, there was no oak tree to shelter him, no curtain to mask him, no silence to cloak his steps. Iron shackles clamped around his wrists, biting like fangs. His journey from the shadows into the center of judgment had come. The trial was swift. It was not a trial in truth, but a ritual of its own, designed to restore the illusion of order. The courthouse smelled of ink and sweat, its benches filled with townsfolk whispering. The charges were read as if already carved in stone. There was no defense, no plea, only the inevitability of the verdict. Death by hanging. The words fell with the weight of a stone into water. Ripples spread through the room, though no one truly doubted the outcome. On the morning of his execution, Henry stood before the gallows. His rags clung to him, torn and worn, yet they looked like vestments, robes of a priest delivering his last sermon. The crowd gathered, murmuring, waiting for spectacle. But Henry gave them nothing. He did not weep. He did not beg. He did not curse. His silence was his final rebellion. If he spoke at all, it was only one phrase, carried on the wind so faintly that some swore they imagined it. Even silence remembers. The trapdoor fell, and with it, Henry's body, but his silence lingered, stretched across the square like a shadow that could not be erased. The town returned to its routines. The courthouse locked its doors. The masters tightened their grip. Yet in the quarters, when fires burned low and songs carried soft through the night, Henry's silence was remembered not as absence, but as presence. His death ended his body, but his silence became a language that no rope could strangle. Henry Fields was gone, but his shadow lingered. In the days that followed his execution, the plantation belt tightened its grip, patrols doubled, rifles gleamed under the sun, and chains grew heavier. Preachers thundered louder from pulpits, declaring that order must be maintained, that rebellion was sin, that silence was obedience. The masters needed not only to punish the body of Henry but to erase the memory of him. In the official ledgers, his name was scratched out. In the records of the court, his case was written plainly, "Slave executed for murder," as if nothing more existed. They sought to turn his story into a warning, a ghost meant to terrify rather than inspire. But the soil does not forget, and neither do the oppressed. In the slave quarters, voices carried softer, but their words held iron. Around fires, mothers sang lullabies, in which Henry's name slipped between the notes. Children whispered it when they played games with stones and sticks, passing it as though it were contraband. Men and women, after a day's labor, would lower their heads and recall his silence, his defiance, his final words. Even silence remembers. It became more than a phrase. It became a mantra, a reminder that chains could bind flesh but not memory, that the act of speaking or refusing to speak could be resistance. The masters lived restless. Some swore they heard footsteps in the fields at night, as though Henry still walked among the rows of cotton. Others claimed the old oak tree groaned heavier in storms, as if carrying his weight again. Whether superstition or guilt, the result was the same. Henry's absence had become a presence. Every attempt to bury him made him rise in whispers. Every erasure gave him permanence. His death had created not a void, but a haunting. And so the consequences of his act spread, not in ink or proclamation, but in sleepless nights, in murmured songs, in the quiet fire of eyes that refused to dim. Henry Fields was gone, yet in the silence he left behind, the world of the enslaved found a strange and dangerous inheritance, memory. Henry Fields was not written into history as a hero. He was branded a criminal, condemned, forgotten in official lines of ink, yet in the shadows where memory breathes, he remained. To the masters, he was terror. To the enslaved, he was comfort. To history, he was a question. What is justice when law is injustice itself? Crowns may glitter, whips may crack, but even in rags, even in silence, justice can rise.